In 2022, attackers didn't hack Uber with some elite zero-day exploit. They simply logged in. A contractor's credentials were stolen, then hit with non-stop MFA prompts until one got approved. That was it. Inside access, internal systems exposed. Around the same time, breaches tied to Cisco and Twilio followed a similar pattern, not breaking zero trust, but quietly bypassing weak implementations of it. The truth is, most companies don't lose because the model fails. They lose because of small gaps attackers know how to exploit. In today's video, we're breaking down exactly how hackers bypass weak zero-trust systems, scenario by scenario. Beginners, stay tuned because you are going to learn a lot today. Let's start with the most common and most dangerous entry point in modern cyber attacks, stealing valid user credentials. Now think about this for a second. If an attacker logs in using a real username and password, are they hacking? Or are they just another user? That's the problem. In a weak zero-trust setup, identity becomes the new perimeter. But if identity itself is compromised, the entire system starts trusting the attacker. This is exactly what happened in multiple real-world incidents, including the breach of Uber. The attacker didn't exploit a server. They didn't break encryption. They simply obtained valid credentials through phishing and social engineering. So how does this actually happen? Step 1, phishing. The attacker sends a fake login page that looks identical to something like a corporate VPN or SSO portal. The user enters their credentials thinking it's legitimate. In reality, they've just handed over access. Step 2, credential reuse. Many users still reuse passwords across platforms. If one service gets breached, attackers test those same credentials across enterprise systems. Step 3, buying access. There are entire marketplaces where stolen credentials are sold, especially for corporate accounts. Now here's where weak zero trust fails. If the system only checks, is this a valid user, and stops there, the attacker walks right in. No further validation, no context, no behavioral checks. A strong zero-trust model would ask more questions. Is this login coming from a new location, a new device? Is the behavior unusual for this user? So the key takeaway is simple. Zero trust is not about trusting identities. It is about continuously verifying them. Because if you trust a compromised identity, you are not stopping the attacker. You are inviting them in. Now let's talk about something even more deceptive, MFA fatigue attacks. Most beginners think multi-factor authentication is the ultimate defense. And yes, it's powerful, but only if it's used correctly. Attackers today are not trying to break MFA. They are trying to exploit human behavior around it. Here's how it works. Once an attacker already has a user's username and password, they attempt to log in repeatedly, over and over again. Each attempt triggers an MFA push notification to the user's phone. Approve sign in, approve sign in, approve sign in. Now imagine you're an employee at 11 p.m. Your phone keeps buzzing. You get tired. You get annoyed. And at some point, many users just tap approve to make it stop. That one tap is the breach. This exact tactic was used in the attack on Uber. The attacker spammed MFA requests until the user finally accepted one. No hacking tools, no complex exploit, just pressure and timing. Now ask yourself, did MFA fail here? No, the implementation failed. In a weak zero-trust system, MFA is treated as a one-time checkpoint. Once approved, the system fully trusts the session. But a strong zero-trust model adds intelligence. It limits repeated MFA attempts. It detects unusual login patterns. It uses number matching or device-based verification instead of simple approve buttons. It flags suspicious behavior in real time. So the key lesson is this. Security is not just about adding layers. It's about understanding how those layers can be manipulated. Because attackers don't always break your defenses, sometimes they just wait for you to approve them. Now let's move to a concept that sounds safe on paper but becomes dangerous in practice: trusted devices. In many zero-trust implementations, once a device is marked as trusted, it gets smoother access. Fewer prompts, less friction, faster workflows. But here's the question you should always ask. What happens if that trusted device gets compromised? Attackers don't always go after accounts first. Sometimes they go after the device itself. Through malware, phishing downloads, browser exploits, or even malicious extensions, they gain control of a machine that the system already trusts. Now, from the system's point of view, everything looks normal. Correct user, recognized device, no red flags. But in reality, the attacker is operating from inside that trusted environment. This is exactly why modern attacks often focus on endpoint compromise. Once inside a device, attackers can steal session tokens, capture keystrokes, or silently execute actions without triggering login alerts. Weak zero-trust setups make a critical mistake here. They treat device trust as static. Once trusted, always trusted. But a strong zero-trust model treats devices like identities, continuously verified. Is the device still compliant? Are security patches up to date? Is there unusual activity happening on the endpoint? Has the device suddenly started accessing sensitive data it never touched before? If those checks are missing, the attacker doesn't need to break in again. They are already inside. So the key takeaway is simple. A trusted device is only safe until the moment it gets compromised. And in cybersecurity, trust without continuous verification is just a delayed breach. Now let's talk about one of the most overlooked weaknesses in zero trust, over-permissive access. Even if you verify the user perfectly, what they can access after login matters just as much. Here's the mistake many organizations make. Once a user is authenticated, they are given broad access across systems, files, or applications, not because they need it, but because it's convenient. This is called excessive privilege. Now imagine an attacker gets hold of a low-level employee's credentials, maybe someone from HR, support, or marketing. In a properly designed system, the damage should be limited, but in a weak zero-trust setup, that same account might have access to internal dashboards, shared drives, customer data, or even admin panels, and that's where things escalate. A real-world example of this pattern showed up in the breach involving Okta. Attackers initially gained limited access through a third-party support account. But due to excessive permissions and poor segmentation, they were able to view sensitive internal systems that should never have been exposed at that level. This is how small breaches turn into major incidents, not because attackers are powerful, but because access is too wide. In strong zero-trust architecture, access is tightly controlled using the principle of least privilege. Users get only what they absolutely need, nothing more. Access is time-bound. Sensitive actions require re-verification, and permissions are continuously reviewed. So even if an attacker logs in, their movement is restricted. But in weak implementations, once inside, it's like walking into a building where every door is already unlocked. So the key takeaway is this: authentication gets you in. Authorization determines how much damage you can do. Now let's get into something that feels almost invisible: session hijacking. Most IT executives focus on login security, username, password, MFA. But what happens after login is just as critical. Once a user successfully authenticates, the system creates a session. Think of it like a temporary pass that says, "This user is already verified." Now here's the problem. If an attacker can steal that session, they don't need the password, they don't need MFA, they simply reuse the session and walk in as the user. This is exactly what makes session hijacking so dangerous. Attackers can steal session tokens using browser malware, malicious extensions, man-in-the-middle attacks, or even through vulnerabilities in web applications. In some cases, something as simple as an unsecured Wi-Fi network can expose session data. There have been multiple real-world cases where attackers used stolen session tokens to access cloud dashboards and email systems without ever triggering a login alert. Why? Because from the system's perspective, the session is already trusted. Now look at where weak zero trust fails. Many implementations focus heavily on login verification but ignore session security. Once the session is created, it is trusted for hours, sometimes even days, without revalidation. A strong zero-trust model does not stop at login. It continuously checks the session. Is the user's behavior still normal? Has the IP address suddenly changed? Is the device fingerprint consistent? Is sensitive data being accessed unexpectedly? If something looks off, the session should be terminated or re-authentication should be triggered. So the key takeaway is this: if an attacker steals the session, they become the user. And if your system blindly trusts that session, zero trust has already been bypassed. Now let's shift focus from users to something many beginners ignore: APIs and applications. Modern companies don't just run on logins, they run on APIs. Every mobile app, every web dashboard, every integration you see is constantly talking to back-end services through APIs. And here's the catch: attackers don't always go after the front door. Sometimes they go straight to the back end. A real-world example of this pattern appeared in the breach linked to T-Mobile, where attackers exploited weaknesses in exposed application interfaces to access sensitive customer data. No need to bypass zero trust at the login layer if the back end is already vulnerable. So how does this work? Attackers look for poorly secured APIs, endpoints without proper authentication, broken authorization checks, or excessive data exposure. For example, an API might verify that a user is logged in, but fail to check what data that user is allowed to access. By simply modifying a request, attackers can pull data that belongs to other users. This is called broken object-level authorization, and it is one of the most common API vulnerabilities. Now here's where weak zero trust fails. Many organizations focus heavily on identity, devices, and network controls, but completely overlook application-level security. They assume that if the user is verified, the application is safe. That assumption is dangerous. A strong zero trust model extends all the way to the application layer. Every API call must be authenticated and authorized, data access must be strictly scoped, inputs must be validated, and unusual patterns must be monitored. So the key takeaway is this: you can lock down identities perfectly, but if your APIs are weak, attackers won't log in. They'll just talk directly to your systems and pull the data themselves. Now let's talk about how attackers expand inside a network: lateral movement through weak segmentation. Getting in is only step one. Real damage happens after that. Imagine an attacker compromises one employee account or one device. In a strong zero-trust environment, that access should be isolated. The attacker should hit walls immediately, but in many organizations, those walls don't really exist. Once inside, systems are still loosely connected. Internal apps trust each other, networks are flat or poorly segmented, and suddenly, one compromised entry point becomes a pathway to everything. This is exactly what made incidents like the breach of Target so severe. Attackers initially gained access through a third-party vendor account. But because internal segmentation was weak, they moved across systems until they reached sensitive payment data. That's lateral movement, from one system to another, from one privilege level to a higher one, quietly expanding access without triggering alarms. Now here's where weak zero trust fails. Organizations implement strong authentication at the entry point, but once inside, they treat the internal network as trusted. That completely breaks the zero trust principle. A strong zero trust model assumes breach at all times. Even inside the network, every request should be verified. Access between systems should be tightly controlled. Microsegmentation should limit how far any single identity or device can move, so even if an attacker gets in, they are contained. But without segmentation, it's like entering a building where every room is connected by open doors. So the key takeaway is this: the real question is not, can an attacker get in? It is, what can they reach after they do? Because if movement is unrestricted, one small breach can become a full-scale compromise. Now let's talk about one of the most underestimated entry points: supply chain or third-party access. Most companies focus on securing their own employees, their own devices, their own systems. But attackers often take a different route. They target the people you trust. Vendors, contractors, support partners, anyone who has legitimate access to your environment but operates outside your direct control. A powerful example of this was the breach of Target, where attackers didn't directly hack the company. They first compromised a third-party HVAC vendor. From there, they used that trusted access to move into Target's internal network. This is the supply chain problem. You may have strong zero-trust controls internally, but if a third-party account has weak security, it becomes the easiest way in. Now think about it. Does every vendor follow strict security practices? Do they enforce strong MFA? Do they monitor their own systems as rigorously as you do? Often the answer is no. And attackers know that. They specifically look for the weakest link in the chain, not the strongest. In weak zero-trust implementations, third-party access is often overtrusted. Once a vendor is onboarded, their access is rarely reviewed. Permissions are often too broad, and monitoring is minimal. A strong zero-trust model treats third parties just like internal users, sometimes even more strictly. Access should be limited to specific resources. Sessions should be monitored closely, and permissions should be time-bound and regularly audited. So the key takeaway is this: your security is not just defined by your systems, it is defined by everyone who can access them. And sometimes, the easiest way to breach a company is not to attack it directly, but to walk in. Now let's talk about the final move attackers make once they're inside: disabling monitoring or logging. Up to this point, everything we discussed is about getting in and moving around. But professional attackers have one more priority. They don't just want access, they want silence. Because if your monitoring is active, every unusual login, every privilege change, every data access attempt can raise alerts. That's a risk for them. So what do? They go after your visibility. A clear example of this behavior was seen during the SolarWinds attack. Once attackers gained access, they didn't immediately cause damage. They carefully disabled or evaded logging mechanisms to stay undetected for months. This is not noisy hacking. This is controlled patient intrusion. Now here's where weak zero trust fails. Many organizations focus heavily on prevention, identity checks, MFA, device validation, but they treat monitoring as secondary. Logs are not centralized. Alerts are not properly configured, or worse, logging can be turned off without strict controls. That creates a dangerous situation. If an attacker can disable logs or bypass monitoring, it's like turning off security cameras in a building. After that, they can move freely without being noticed. A strong zero trust model assumes that breaches can happen, which means detection is just as important as prevention. Logs must be tamper-proof. Monitoring should be continuous and automated. Any attempt to disable logging should immediately trigger high-priority alerts. And critical systems should have layered visibility, not a single point of failure. So the key takeaway is this: if you can't see what's happening, you can't stop it. And once attackers silence your monitoring, they are no longer trying to get in. They are already in, and now they're making sure no one knows. So now you've seen the reality. Zero Trust doesn't fail because the idea is flawed. It fails because it's implemented halfway. Credentials get stolen, MFA gets abused, devices get trusted blindly, access is too open, sessions go unchecked, APIs stay exposed, networks lack segmentation, third parties become backdoors, and when attackers finally get in, they silence the system. That's not a security problem. That's a discipline problem. If you're serious about cybersecurity, start thinking like this. Don't just ask, is this secure? Ask, how would I break this? Because that's exactly how attackers think. If this breakdown helped you understand real-world attack paths, hit subscribe and stick around. We break down cybersecurity in a way that actually prepares you for the field, not just exams. And tell me in the comments which scenario surprised you the most, or which one you've actually seen in real environments. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe for more cybersecurity content.